I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing clinical trial recruitment. For those who have listened to past episodes that focus on the life sciences sector, you'll recall that is where I think some of the most complex data protection issues arise. We've done prior episodes on issues like AI and digital health and the uses of health data for secondary research. And today I want to add one more episode to that life sciences list. What are the unique and important challenges arising from when companies use health data to identify, attract, and enroll data subjects into a clinical study? Let's maybe think about this issue in reverse. Here's the challenge. Life sciences companies, pharma, medical device companies, for example, need data to demonstrate the efficacy of their new products so that they can get the relevant FDA clearances and convince the healthcare community that those products effectively address healthcare conditions. To get that data, those companies need to do research. To do that research, they need human data subjects to agree to participate in the research study. And to get those data subjects, companies need to find them and have them enroll in the study. That last part, right? The recruitment and enrollment is not easy and is the focus of today's episode. To discuss, I've invited two of my colleagues, Robert Church and Melissa Levine, to the podcast. Rob is a partner in our FDA practice in Los Angeles. Melissa is a member of our privacy practice who focuses on health and sensitive data. Together, both of them guide many organizations in the life sciences sector on how to address these really difficult issues that arise in connection with the formation of clinical trials, clinical studies, and how to get the right data subjects to participate. Rob, Melissa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Melissa, maybe I can start with you. I mean, this seems like a really big and important issue for life sciences in particular. What are the ways that life sciences organizations are engaged in to try to find those data subjects, those potential candidates for their studies?
So we've seen companies use a variety of methods. Certainly, a big source of potential patients for recruitment into a clinical trial is electronic medical record systems that healthcare providers have. That's a treasure trove of available data on who might be eligible to participate in a particular trial. Other entities as well have big databases of individuals that could be eligible to participate in a trial. There are clinical trial recruitment websites. There are websites that are run on particular disease states where people express an interest in a particular disease state and learning more about it and could be recruited for a trial from that. And there's also existing research participants that have participated in a trial and agree to be contacted about other potential trial opportunities should they arise in a similar disease state or for which they might be eligible.
So it's almost like an all of the above strategy, right? Every way that you can find ways of both identifying and then engaging with the data subjects that may be inclined to participate in a study or may be eligible to participate in a study. Because I got to imagine one of the concerns here or limitations is that not every individual is eligible for a particular study. Instead, you're really looking for a specific set of community members, and that may not be a large group.
That's right. It's a particular cohort that meets certain requirements. Sometimes it's having a particular disease state, but there are a number of requirements for who would be eligible to participate in a clinical trial. And so that's where large databases that have access to that information are useful in being able to spot and sort through and identify individuals that meet that criteria and may be eligible.
Yeah. And Rob, all of this to me sounds expensive. It sounds like it requires a significant investment in order for life sciences organizations to be able to identify these potential participants What is really, from a business perspective, what is driving kind of that investment and this level of engagement to try to identify the relevant subject participants?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So a very large part of my practice is working with, kind of big pharma companies, mid-sized pharma companies, small biotech companies, and they all have one goal in mind, which is trying to bring new pharmaceutical and biotechnology products to market and do it as quickly as they can. And it's just the clinical research world has just gotten very competitive. So there are lots of studies, in every condition you can imagine, all running at the same time. And the sponsors for each of those studies is equally, kind of interested in getting those studies enrolled as fast as possible. So it's created a very, competitive recruitment environment where, every company is doing everything in its power to move not only the studies as fast as possible, but the recruitment itself. And so you're right, Scott, there are an enormous amount of resources being poured into this space. And we see just within the last few years in particular, just an entirely new set of tools that companies are using to try to get subjects enrolled more quickly. Things like, working aggressively with social media, reaching out directly to patient advocacy groups, actually putting consultants on site at clinical trial sites where consultants themselves can do medical record reviews and try to find eligible subjects. So it raises lots of interesting legal questions, both from an FDA standpoint, which is kind of where I practice, as well as a privacy standpoint, which is Melissa's world. But yeah, it's a very competitive environment these days, and we're seeing, all sorts of novel, procedures being used by the companies.
But at its core, this seems to me as though the central tenet is that this is a core component of the R&D efforts
Yeah.
for organizations. So, technology companies, they may spend a lot of time with their engineers to develop new and innovative technology products. The entertainment industry may spend a lot of their R&D efforts developing new entertainment means and shows and vehicles. Like, this is really, in the life sciences space in particular, core to what they do. And if they didn't have access to these patient populations, they would then be either at a disadvantage or not able to innovate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is a core function of companies. It goes along with, sort of being able to identify new molecules to take into the clinic and drafting protocols and having statisticians help design the studies and analyze the results, and getting patients recruited is just one more piece to all of that. And I should say as well, even though companies are, many of the companies that we work with are trying to find novel, aggressive new ways to attract and enroll new subjects into studies, there really are some fundamental sort of legal considerations that companies need to take into consideration, right? There are ethical standards regarding how you attract patients into studies. You have to make sure that you comply with FDA's informed consent regulations, the institutional review board regulations, just making sure that information that's presented to patients through the recruitment process is not in any way misleading, that it doesn't promise a cure of the drug. So everything that we're talking about here sort of takes place in a landscape that's been highly developed over the last 50 years or so, but it's just trying to find these new modalities of attracting patients into the studies that I think companies are really looking at these days.
Well, why don't we just maybe go into the understanding of what is it, those legal issues, how those legal issues popping that you were describing, Rob. So maybe we can start with the data, Melissa, because as you were describing, looking at those registries, looking at those databases, looking at those EMRs, going in through social media to try to identify people, my guess is that each one of those strategies, each one of those particular approaches to identify and then attract data subjects are going to present unique data issues depending on the context in which you're doing it. Interested in your perspective about how you approach a problem like that and the issues that are coming to your mind as you're trying to sort out how to think about this from a privacy point of view.
Sure, Scott. So, first, whether or not we're accessing existing EMR systems or collecting consumer health data or accessing information from a research study from a prior participant, we need to make sure that we have the right legal permissions in place to do so. So to the extent that HIPAA applies, HIPAA requires either an IRB waiver of the HIPAA authorization requirement or a HIPAA authorization in order to access PHI for research purposes, but has a special exception in the context of clinical trial recruitment, and reviews preparatory to research to prepare a research protocol or identify individuals who may be eligible for participation in a research study, where pharma company representatives or other third-party researchers can come on site to review the records and identify those folks who might be eligible. But the protected health information can't leave the site, and the pharma company reps or the third-party researchers are not allowed to contact those individuals directly without the additional HIPAA overlay of either an authorization or an IRB waiver of the authorization requirement for the clinical trial recruitment outreach. And then we also have state privacy laws, state consumer health privacy laws that regulate collection and use of consumer health data. If HIPAA doesn't apply, we also have state consumer laws generally and privacy laws and sensitive condition laws, all of which require consent in certain circumstances to collect or access or use or share health information. And then if we're talking about an existing research study that we're collecting information from and contacting participants in, we also have to make sure that the informed consent form enabled the further outreach and contact for additional studies. And then if we're talking about, websites or social media, there are issues with collecting and tracking individuals and contacting them from those sites. So we've kind of got an array of laws that govern whether or not we have access to the information. And so part of figuring this out, making sure the approach to clinical trial recruitment is permissible, is understanding what laws the data is subject to and ensuring we have the right permissions in place to access it, use it, and to contact potential participants.
I think that's a really important point, that first part, right, where you're saying one of the key threshold questions is to identify what laws are going to apply, at least here in the United States. Oftentimes it will depend on the context that you are processing this data, the way the data was collected, what the status is, or what industry the companies are providing. But maybe to really kind of tease some of those questions out, why don't we maybe just start with an example, which I know comes up often in my practice, and I am sure in both of yours, where you have a sponsor who is looking to conduct a study, perhaps of a rare disease. And so they contact the healthcare providers, maybe an academic medical center, maybe a specialized healthcare clinic, and they say, hey, can you let us know which patients you have that have, these particular markers or these particular healthcare conditions, these particular diagnoses? We would love to, get them enrolled in a study. And that would involve, if that were to proceed, the sponsor saying, here is the criteria that I need, then the healthcare provider combing through the records that she or he maintain about their patients, and then coming up with some way where those patients then are given the opportunity to engage in the study. How do you think through those set of questions, which I know are probably that fact pattern repeats itself over and over again in different contexts?
So from a privacy perspective, the initial request from the pharma company is perfectly permissible. The provider can go through their records and identify patients that may be eligible. But what can't happen without some additional requirements being met is the disclosure of that patient information to the pharma company. That disclosure is not permissible in most cases if HIPAA applies or state privacy laws are applicable. But instead, the provider could reach out to those patients, ask if they're interested, give them the contact information for the relevant site for the study, and enable the patient to contact a site to potentially enroll. Or the provider could reach out themselves to the patients and suggest that they provide an authorization, or the pharma company could get an IRB waiver for the disclosure of that information.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, and I know one of the other ways that this comes up is sometimes it's not the healthcare provider who's being asked to look through their records, but it could be the vendor to a number of healthcare providers who say, hey, can you look through the records that you maintain on behalf of a bunch of healthcare providers? Can you help me understand how many people you have that fit these particular criteria and who they are? And my guess is, and I know that that presents a number of different legal considerations.
It's true that vendor may not have permission to be using the data or accessing it for those purposes. The vendor is often a business associate for HIPAA purposes or a processor, sometimes under state law, and is restricted in their ability to use the information that they have access to provide a service, in essence, to the upstream entity. So unless their contracts permit them to be doing that kind of searching and analysis on behalf of the upstream customer, they may not have permission to do so.
Yeah, Rob, I mean, I'm interested from your perspective. You mentioned, when you were identifying some of the legal concerns with these types of engagement activities and recruitment, consent was one of the key components, transparency, ethical considerations. And my guess is one of the challenges with doing any of those things is that what is the time that you're trying to get a consent and what is the time that you're providing kind of all of that or the irrelevant information for patients? Because presumably we're engaged in this process to recruit individuals because they have not otherwise already engaged with you or they have not already as agreed to participate in a particular study. So interested from your perspective how that organization should be thinking about consent, notice, and all of the various things that would help the patient understand what is involved in the study.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question, kind of, how consent sort of, fits within the rest of this and, at what point you need to get IRB reviews of recruitment materials. But basically, FDA has historically said that the informed consent process basically begins as soon as you start talking to a patient about enrollment in the study. That's not to say that you need to get a full informed consent form signed before you even have a conversation with the patient, but you should make sure that whatever information you're providing a patient at the earliest phase about a potential study is balanced, is thoughtful, and does not make any sort of promises of a cure or of a treatment effect, right? This is a human subject experiment involving an investigational unapproved product, right? And so we always counsel our clients to be very, very careful about whatever materials that they're going to be scripting at this sort of early stage that could be presented to a potential study subject. And, ideally for most of this stuff, if it gets into any level of detail, as I said, there should be an IRB review and approval of these recruitment materials. There's some limited exceptions to that. If all you're doing is saying there's a study in a particular kind of cancer enrolling across town, if it's very limited, sometimes you can just rely on, publicly available information, the type of information that you might see on clinicaltrials.gov. But more often than not, especially in many cases, some of the scenarios that Melissa was just talking about, drug companies will actually go to other doctors in the same geographic vicinity as a clinical trial site and to see if those other institutions have patients they can refer to the clinical trial site. So that needs to be managed very carefully. Very often, Melissa and I work together on those sorts of things because, to the extent that you want to pay the referring sites to spend some time looking through their patient records to determine if there's any, possibly eligible subjects for the studies, you'll need some sort of consulting agreement in place. As I said, you need to make sure that all of the information that you provide to the site is thoughtfully considered where appropriate, that there's been an IRB approval. And then, where Melissa steps in here is making sure that, as she was just describing a few minutes ago there, that whatever information that the patient is sharing or that the referring site is sharing, either with the company or with the clinical trial site, that's been, sort of their appropriate HIPAA authorizations in place to sort of manage those communications. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot baked in. I mean, in many cases, we work with companies that are sort of falling behind on their recruitment and like, oh, we'll just reach out to some other oncologists nearby in the same town, some people that we know. But there's a lot that goes into it, the contracts, the IRB materials, the various privacy authorizations.
And Rob, I mean, I am no healthcare compliance lawyer, but I do know enough to say that anytime you're making a payment to a physician, that you need to talk with somebody who knows this stuff to make sure that that's being done correctly. If you're saying that one of the avenues that clients would like to proceed in is potentially having some sort of payment consulting type of arrangement for payment of time if we're combing through those records. It sounds to me like there's a lot of traps for the unwary there. to make sure that those relationships are being accurately documented, structured in accordance with the applicable laws, and that there's not any appearance that there would be, any kickback or any of those other type of fraud and abuse considerations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, although I'm an FDA lawyer and not a fraud and abuse lawyer, that is one of the things that we always check with our experts on to make sure that payments are fair market value, there's an appropriate contract in place, they're bona fide services, that the company who's making the payments is actually that they need the services that they're actually looking for subjects to be referred to a clinical site. But you're right, Scott. I mean, it does add yet one more layer of complexity in addition to the FDA laws and the privacy laws. There's also the fraud and abuse laws that you have to think about whenever you're providing anything of value to a healthcare professional, whether it's the clinical site itself, a referring physician, another healthcare professional who may be consulting for the study. All those individuals would need to go through that analysis.
So one other consideration in connection with payment, Scott, is from a privacy perspective under HIPAA prohibits the payment for PHI. So we would want to make sure that any contract documenting payment to a provider to prepare information or to go through their records to identify potential participants is a reasonable cost-based fee in connection with the preparation and transmission of the information, assuming transmission is permissible, rather than a payment for the data that's being shared.
Right. So perhaps one practice point here is that as soon as you start seeing any type of exchange of payments or money in connection with any of these recruiting efforts, you're going to want to talk with somebody who is expert in this space, because it sounds like it's multidimensional in terms of the legal issues that would present.
That's right.
So maybe Melissa and Rob, I'm interested in another thing that you were mentioning, and that's really how organizations are using social media and similar technology to engage in this type of recruiting. Because Melissa, as you mentioned when you were going through the issues that you're on the lookout for, is that the social media platforms may be governed and subject to a number of other considerations outside of HIPAA. And as a result, you will want to make sure that you're not only just thinking about this from a traditional HIPAA lens, but you're also thinking about it from a state law perspective, from a consumer protection law perspective, and in the list of state laws itself is growing. So interested in how you're approaching that analysis and how you're thinking about enabling clients to make use of a strong platform while not creating additional legal challenges.
Sure. So from a privacy perspective, some of the considerations are the state laws, as you mentioned, some of which require consent for collection and use of information. And so also the state consumer health data privacy laws require a particular consumer health data privacy policy on the website, separate from the main website privacy policy. So first order is making sure you've got the right privacy policy and notice in place. The second is making sure that you've got any necessary consents under applicable state law, but also the FTC has been very focused on enforcement of web trackers and pixels and other similar types of technology that are collecting information, possibly even just IP address and the fact that someone's interested in a particular disease state or drug that may be indicative of a health condition, that collection of information alone is a collection of health data and requires express consent from an FTC perspective. So making sure that any information that you're collecting is with the proper consents and notice, and to the extent that you're sharing any of that information through web trackers and technology, similar technology, that you've got the consents in place to do so.
Yeah, and probably it's through the trackers and then also different type of campaigns, because, I think, Rob, you're making the right point that you'd say it's not only the identification of who the individuals are that are going to participate in a study, but you also need to get them to agree to then want to participate in a study. And so that second point, just because we know who the people are, doesn't mean that they're all going to sign up for the study. And so oftentimes there needs to be additional effort to whether outreach or frankly, just almost advertising to those individuals to participate, which could take the form of like custom audience events within different types of engagement platforms, where you'd say, hey, please send advertisements to, these 200 people because I know that they are the ones who would be eligible for my study, and I would want to get in front of them to let them know that this study is available to them. Melissa, I know that disclosure itself has a number of privacy implications. And Rob, my guess is from your perspective, there's a number of other traps that we want to make sure we're considering there.
Yeah, definitely. And if I can just go back to the social media for a moment as well. I mean, that is one of those areas where, as I say, there's sort of all the traditional laws that still apply, the ones that go back for decades, wanting to make sure that there's any recruitment materials, to the extent necessary, they've been reviewed by an IRB, that you're not making any sort of promises of safety and effectiveness. But the other thing, when companies are heavily involved in designing social media materials and having a social media site or a platform that they're using, in many cases, companies also have to be very thoughtful in terms of how they interact with the other people on the social media platform, but also the platform itself. So one of the things that comes up is if there's a social media outlet somewhere and people are free to provide comments on, one of these sites or a page somewhere, and somebody says, oh, I had a bad experience with, I was in another study, I had a bad experience with a product, I got terrible headaches afterwards. Well, that's adverse event information that, companies that if they're actively setting up some of these pages, they need to monitor that and potentially report some of that adverse event information to FDA. The other thing that we sometimes get questions on is it okay for companies to hit the like button if they see a comment that they like? Somebody says, oh, I was in a trial. It was great. I had a fabulous experience. It made a big improvement in my condition, right? Company gives a thumbs up to that. Need to be careful about those sorts of things. And so with most of our clients, and I'm sure it's the same thing in the privacy world, to the extent that they're using social media to try to recruit studies and kind of just raise awareness about a disease and the fact that the company is conducting trials, is to have a really solid social media policy. That it may be kind of a broad policy that touches on lots of different areas, but if you're going to be using it for study recruitment, then it should talk about that as well.
Yeah, really interesting. And maybe kind of my final question here is really around how organizations can start to think about their research projects in a more proactive, prospective manner. And I'm going to start with an assumption. You guys can tell me if I'm wrong, but probably one of the key areas of data to identify a potential population for a study may be going back to prior studies that you've already had some of those data subjects in. In other words, you already know that there's a group of people who are inclined to participate in a study and thus may be interested in being willing to engage in another study of interest or of help to them. The uses of existing research data to attract or pull together a new group or cohort of potential data subjects for a study, I think raises a number of legal issues, from the data to the FDA to the consents and so on. Interested in your perspective about what those legal issues are, and then second, how organizations can maybe get out ahead of them while they're planning today's research with tomorrow's research in mind.
So from a privacy perspective, ideally the informed consents would have language in there that would enable recontacting of existing participants about future research studies. To the extent that that language isn't there, then we have to meet some of the other kind of legal hurdles around consent, IRB waiver, trying to make sure we address it in another way. But in terms of future proofing, the best thing to do would be to have language that enables participants to choose to opt in to be contacted for future research studies of interest. But then you also have to manage that on the back end, making sure that you're not contacting anyone who didn't opt in or who did but withdrew consent. So it's not only the language there, but also managing to who you're following up with. Rob, and I'm sure there's FDA issues with that too.
Yeah, and just some basic, medical and science issues. I mean, in many cases, if a subject has already participated in a study of one investigational drug, the inclusion-exclusion criteria for the next study of that drug may say that, if you've already been treated with the drug, you can't come back for a second study. But it does raise another interesting question, which is just more broadly the community around a particular disease, and especially for rare diseases, we're seeing this more and more, that there can be patient advocacy groups, disease advocacy groups, and we're seeing many of our clients, especially working in the rare disease space, trying to create tighter bonds with those advocacy groups and trying to sort of have opportunities to speak to them, present materials to them, to raise awareness about the research that's being conducted, but also to help attract some of those people into their studies. And again, that's sort of tricky because need to make sure that all the messaging that the companies use when they're speaking to those audiences is appropriate, that it doesn't do anything to sort of suggest that the drug can offer safety or effectiveness benefits to anybody who's in the study. And then Melissa, I think, we've discussed this in the past. If somebody from a company goes out and presents to a patient advocacy group at a conference or something, have to be very careful about whether they sort of collect information about a patient or a family member that comes up and speaks to them afterwards and expresses an interest in being in the study.
That's right. And whether they follow up with those individuals, whether they've gotten permission or inform them that they may use any information they're collecting for those purposes.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, maybe I'm sure, the audience here is probably interested in maybe one last question. And that is, okay, this sounds like there are a lot of things I need to do. I mean, what happens if I get it wrong? And, Melissa, I'm probably more familiar with what that looks like from a data perspective, but interested in your views on that. And then Rob, from your perspective, what could happen on this side, including up to, does this mean that our whole study could potentially be invalidated in some way? Melissa, why don't you go first there?
So from a privacy perspective, there has been FTC enforcement where there's not express consent through websites and trackers. That can result in fines. It can result in purging of data in extreme cases. State enforcement and HIPAA enforcement often are around civil penalties, but they typically are to the site who's making the disclosure of information that's subject to those laws. But there is the potential for criminal penalties for receipt of protected health information in violation of HIPAA for commercial purposes. So just something to be thoughtful of. And of course, you don't want to cause your best contacts of healthcare providers to violate their requirements under the law.
From my perspective, so first of all, I'll say that probably most of the compliance and enforcement risk is probably more in Melissa's world with the privacy issues, but there are FDA risks associated with kind of using aggressive subject recruitment tactics. First of all, we haven't really talked about this here, but another thing that a lot of companies sort of focus on is sort of paying subjects additional amount of money to enter into a study, or paying sites more money to incentivize them to find patients more quickly. And there's ethical concerns about that, sort of trying to, sort of unduly influence somebody's judgment to enter into a trial. But and those are all of great concern. But I think, one very real world issue that companies need to think about is if they are too aggressive, either with sort of offering payments to subjects to enter the study, or for sites for finding, subjects who may be eligible. Using aggressive recruitment tactics can potentially end up with patients who get enrolled in the study who don't really belong there. Either they don't want to be in the study, they never really wanted to be, it was against their better judgment, but they go in and then, halfway through the study, they're like, you know what, I'm just not committed, I'm going to stop, right? And then you lose a patient in the trial, and that can be very damaging when you start losing subjects. But even of greater concern, if a patient does not meet the eligibility criteria for a study, FDA finds those patients and will throw them out. So if a company is being very aggressive in terms of trying to put people into the study who don't really belong, and trying to not be as rigorous as they should be in terms of checking the enrollment criteria for those subjects, you can lose subjects from the trial. And to your point, Scott, you could actually damage the overall results of the study. If it damages the integrity because you don't have the statistical power anymore, and we've seen that happen, that can be the death knell to a very large, very important study for some companies.
Melissa, Rob, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.